There are places where mountains of cash and a valid passport won't help you. Remote islands, bureaucratic nightmares, or dangerous dictatorships. Forget ordinary travel. These are the 10 most inaccessible countries on Earth. The isolated Himalayan kingdom of Bhutan applies a completely unique approach to foreigners. It does not filter entry into its territory through complex political processes, but purely by the size of your wallet. Independent travel is strictly banned by law. Every visitor must use the services of a licensed state agency and pay a fixed daily fee. Together with the Sustainable Development Fee, this amounts to hundreds of dollars per single night. The official government strategy bears the noble title High Value, Low Impact. In practice, however, it means only one thing. Mass tourism has no place here. Unless you possess massive financial reserves to spend on just a few days, this country remains tightly closed. Bhutan simply makes it clear that budget travelers are not welcome. Turkmenistan is considered one of the most closed and bizarre countries on the planet. Obtaining a tourist visa to this Central Asian state borders on a pure lottery. The entire process requires an official invitation approved by the State Migration Service, with the percentage of unexplained rejections being massive. Free and independent movement of foreigners around the country practically does not exist. From the moment of arrival until departure, every tourist must be under the constant supervision of a licensed guide. This guide acts as a government handler, strictly controlling your itinerary, accommodation, and determining what you can and cannot photograph. Any wandering on your own is strictly forbidden. The country remains a completely unreachable place for the vast majority of humanity. The smallest island republic in the world, Nauru, holds a sad primacy as one of the least visited places on Earth. The main obstacle is the transport itself. Only a single national airline flies to this isolated piece of land in the Pacific Ocean, featuring an extremely irregular flight schedule. If a flight gets canceled, you can involuntarily become stranded on the island for weeks. To this, one must add the opaque visa approval process, a total absence of embassies worldwide, and absolutely zero tourist infrastructure. Public transport does not operate on the island, and accommodation options are critically limited. The result is total isolation, causing this forgotten piece of land surrounded by coral reefs to be visited by barely a few dozen people annually. African Equatorial Guinea grew fabulously wealthy thanks to vast oil reserves, yet it hermetically closed itself off from the world. The local authoritarian regime views every foreigner as a potential threat to its stability. Obtaining a tourist visa is a process filled with endless bureaucracy, corruption, and absurd requirements, including the necessity of a personal invitation from government officials. The application fees themselves are so extremely high that they can completely wipe out your budget before the authorities reject the document without giving any reason. Furthermore, Equatorial Guinea lacks any transparent rules for the movement of foreigners. The country makes it clear that it does not care for curious tourists with cameras. For the vast majority, this oil dictatorship remains an impregnable fortress. The East African nation of Eritrea has earned a chilling but entirely accurate global nickname, the North Korea of Africa. This totalitarian state enforces absolute control over all information, and foreign journalists are strictly banned from entering. If an ordinary tourist manages to obtain a visa after months of opaque processing, their journey immediately hits a bureaucratic wall. The movement of foreigners is legally restricted only to the capital city, Asmara. Any attempt to leave the metropolis and travel into the interior requires a special government permit with a strictly defined route and date. However,
Military guards at checkpoints can confiscate this permit at any time without explanation. Eritrea simply remains a hermetically sealed time capsule of fear for the west of the planet.
The landlocked nation of Chad represents an absolute dead end for the vast majority of travelers. While entry into this Central African country is not entirely blocked by bureaucratic systems, the real situation on the ground makes it one of the least accessible regions worldwide. The main obstacles are ongoing armed conflicts, the presence of radical groups, and extreme security risks in border areas. Tourist infrastructure in the country is practically non-existent, making any safe itinerary planning impossible. Most global embassies issue the highest level of travel warnings for Chad, strongly advising citizens to avoid all travel. If you still attempt to enter legally, you will face opaque checkpoints and the necessity of expensive military escorts. Chad is simply an isolated zone.
The East African nation of Somalia represents an absolutely inaccessible zone for the vast majority of humanity, where ordinary travel rules do not apply. Putting aside the semi-autonomous and relatively more stable Somaliland, the rest of the country has been long paralyzed by civil war. Obtaining a tourist visa to this region is an extremely complex bureaucratic process, which is, however, the least of your concerns. The real barrier to entry is the factual impossibility of survival. Most of the territory is under the control of radical armed groups, and the threat of foreign kidnappings is permanent. Any attempt to move outside the heavily fortified green zone requires the continuous protection of heavily armed private mercenaries. Somalia is simply hermetically sealed by its own destruction.
The Middle Eastern nation of Yemen is essentially a non-existent destination for the outside world, where entry is legally and factually nearly impossible. Years of civil war and a massive humanitarian crisis have completely cut the country off from the rest of the planet. Obtaining a tourist visa is currently practically unrealistic, as foreign embassies do not operate and local authorities flatly reject foreigners. Putting aside the extremely isolated and heavily guarded island of Socotra, mainland Yemen is an absolutely closed zone. Civil air connections are nearly non-existent, maritime borders are blocked, and land crossings are controlled by hostile armed factions. Entry into Yemeni territory is allowed only to selected humanitarian aid workers and war correspondents. For ordinary people, Yemen remains an impregnable territory.
The world's youngest nation, South Sudan, represents an absolutely inaccessible territory for the vast majority of humanity. Since its inception, the country has been locked in a permanent cycle of civil war, ethnic violence, and humanitarian disasters. Obtaining a tourist visa is a process filled with chaos, extreme fees, and arbitrary decisions by officials who automatically suspect foreigners of espionage. Once you cross the border, you find yourself in a country with no functioning infrastructure and absolutely no security guarantees. Moving outside the capital city, Juba, without a heavily armed escort carries a fatal risk of kidnapping or attack by militant groups. South Sudan is simply a harsh zone where ordinary travel rules turn to dust.
At the absolute peak of our ranking, isolated North Korea, the most closed-off state matrix on this planet. Here, it is no longer just about complex bureaucracy, but about the complete surrender of your freedom to the regime the moment you arrive. Independent travel to this country legally does not exist. Entry is allowed only through a state agency, and every tourist is from the first to the last second under the continuous surveillance of 2 state-assigned guides who function as your shadows. Your itinerary is a strictly mandated propaganda tour, and any deviation, unauthorized conversation with a local, or even an incorrectly folded newspaper with a photo of the leader can have fatal consequences. North Korea is an absolute fortress that lets foreigners near only to show them its own carefully directed version of reality.